So our final keynote speaker, a good dear friend, Aaron Lobo, I would like to call him on stage. He's a marine conservationist. He works on a lot of developmental, large-scale projects. Development, when I say not development, but sustainable development. But he's one of those marine conservationists who loves his fish, okay? So he's going to talk a little bit about his journey and how it's all related. So, Aaron, over to you.
Thank you first for inviting me here. I think this is the first time I've come into Nature in Focus, and I'm talking to a slightly different set of people, primarily nature photographers, wildlife photographers, about something they may not see as a usual. I mean, how do you sort of conserve something by eating it? And that's really what I'm going to be talking about, because that's what the seafood sector is pretty much all about. And it is really a sort of a combination of my own personal sort of, academic sort of research journey, and also work on specific developmental projects, primarily in South Asia, West Africa. We're now setting up fisheries monitoring programs. But, basically, how do you sort of, supply fish that is not just, equitable, but something that provides a livelihood to people without actually endangering it through the practices that result in the fish catch. So before I go into that, there's something that came up a very little while ago in the month of June in Goa, and probably many of you are familiar with this story. There was this whole thing of formalin or formaldehyde being traces of formaldehyde being found in fish. And there were like about, I think, 17 trucks somewhere around the middle of June that got raided as they entered the state of Goa. And they found huge concessions. Pretty much all of it had traces of formalin in the fish. Okay, so they did, you had the FDA and others coming up doing these tests, and pretty much all the consignments, with the most commonly eaten fish, mackerel, sardine, your surmai, a whole range of other species that we in Goa commonly eat was found with traces of fish. These trucks were coming in from states, Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, Orissa, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, and basically created a furor among the state, But what was very interesting, around the same time, in the months between the 1st of June and the end of July, there is a 2-month monsoon ban, wherein mechanized trawl boats are banned from going fishing. So there were two things happening. Basically, you had a constant supply of fish that was coming in, and we have these fish vans in the state that had been instituted about 2 years ago by the Fisheries Department to supply, people in Goa with a daily supply of fish, to kind of meet their steady demand of fish curry and rice. But now it is being laced with formalin, So what was really happening? Why were they using formalin in fish? Formalin, as we know, is a fixative. It's a preservative, and it's also known to be carcinogenic. And then, soon after that, it followed by the state instituting a 15-day ban on all fish imports that were coming from other states. So it was very interesting. There was this fish came in. First, there was it was just small traces of formalin being found. Some people even said that it was within the permissible limit. And but then suddenly there was a 15-day ban because people were really sort of upset with it, and they said, what's going on with our food? Basically, we're getting this fish in, and we're having a steady supply of fish, but there's formalin in the fish. And then what happened was, obviously, the prices of fish in the state of Goa just went through the roof. The same fish that was was costing something like 4 to 8 times the price. So that just went through the roof. And then there was even sort of ideas of formalin testing kits and a whole bunch of things that came into that came into the frame. Very similar to the air purifying sort of devices that you now have in most homes, in most offices in Delhi, because of the pollution. So why had we come to a state wherein, we had formaldehyde in a fish? So I got calls from several sort of news media agencies that were asking me, what's going on, what's happening. But for me, formalin in fish and these trade tricks were not new. They've been happening for a very long time. Using preservatives in fish is something that has been done for a very long period of time. Mislabeling of fish is very common in the marketplace, but there is a reason why all this was going on. Okay, so this is a picture that was taken in a lab, several years ago in West Africa. As you can see, those fish are actually fixed. So when you add formalin to fish, you can actually get them in the position that you want them to be. So you spread the fins, you add little pins, and you can fix it. And just all you need is a 10% solution of formalin. So what these guys were doing is they were simply sort of sprinkling formalin in the fish. So if you cut open the fish, their innards were actually rotting in many of them. So you see this is like 3-day-old fish, looks perfectly fresh. But so what I'm going to take you, I'm taking you from here now to to something that I like doing, because I mean seafood means a lot to me, and I think it's one of the many reasons I got into being a marine conservationist as well. So we're dealing with a very globalized seafood market. Now this is one seafood market. Okay, it's called Noryangjin. It's in South Korea. And over here, you have about between 60 to 80 different countries supplying seafood from all across the world. And you can get species of all kinds. You can see over here there are abalone. There are these little what do you call it, ascidians. There's a whole range of bivalves. There's pretty much everything. This was just the bivalve section and the mollusk section. So you had a whole range of species. So when you're talking about this, I mean the markets in India are global in the sense that they're still very national. We do get fish from other parts of South Asia, like from Bangladesh, from Myanmar, but it's still a very sort of a national market, wherein fish is doing the rounds within the country. It's coming from the north to the south, within the states, etc. It's been moving around, but it's been moving around way more than it was, say about 10 years ago. Now, to take you straight down to what I truly love. Okay, it's seafood, and basically this is one of the dishes that I really like because it's really simple to prepare. This is your standard Goan prawn curry rice. Now, when you talk about making a prawn curry rice, okay, many people, if you go to a restaurant, they give you these big chunky prawns, but most coastal communities will tell you that it's a little prawns that are the most tasty ones, So if you go along the Konkan, that's what they'll say, it's a little prawns that are the tastiest prawns. And I eventually learned to not depend on my mother and other people around me and actually make my own sort of prawn curry rice. But before learning to make prawn curry rice, I actually learned how to catch prawns. So this was way back in the year 2002, 2003. I was a master's student in the Wildlife Institute of India, and I was studying sea snakes. I wanted to study sea snakes. And I had no interest in, doing marine ecology work. I was always interested in, herpetofauna, sea snake, in snakes. And, this was a particular group that wasn't very well researched. Now you have, a few sort of, students and researchers in the audience, Chetan Rao and the others who are working on this group. And there's quite a lot of research happening now. But there was very little at that point of time. And, to kind of study sea snakes, I really had to jump on board prawn trawlers, and that's what I did for like 6 months of my field work. So if you see the shrimp that they were targeting were these really small shrimp. It's like this is one of the Metapenaeus prawns that don't grow bigger than that size, and they're the best ones for your prawn curry rice. They're really small, they're the right size, they're tasty. This is very unlike the tiger shrimps, which are much bigger, but they're much better, like fried or barbecued or something like that. It's not good for the prawn curry rice, even though you would imagine so. Now, to catch something that was that small, you saw that the shrimp over there was just a couple of millimeters in length and a few millimeters in thickness. You use this technique called prawn trawling, and that's a sea snake. Okay, it's one of the most common species. It's the beak sea snake because of that little beak-like face, but. The sea snakes are pretty much purely aquatic in the way they live. They give birth live at sea, but they are air breathers. So like other reptiles, they need to surface at regular intervals. And what trawling does is it keeps them submerged for extended periods of time. And obviously, you have a huge mortality. So I found that this was the best way to kind of, look at these animals and understand the drivers. Why were sea snakes dying in prawn or the shrimp trawl fishery? So this is a little clip, from the time of my master's. So it's really, it's going a bit slow, but this was way back in 2002. Yeah, so things look a bit different now. As you can see, the net is just being winched out. It's shot and it's winched out, and it's allowed to be towed behind that trawler for about 3.5 hours. So this was taken just off the coast of Goa. Now these small prawn trawlers were banned even at that point of time, because this particular engine would only allow them to ship to kind of fish very close to the shore. This was less than the 5 nautical mile zone in which they're allowed. And you can see the coastline over there. So they winch up the net, and the net is like a big sock, and the mesh size keeps decreasing as you move from the mouth of the net to the far fag end, which is called the code end. And this method of fishing has been used pretty much globally. In the North Sea to catch cod, and in other parts, like in Asia, to catch shrimp. And if you see, all the catch gets concentrated in that bag net, which has got the really, really small mesh size. And you can see there's a whole array of life forms there, and the sea snakes were among them. Obviously, this was not from one trawl, but from, over several trawls in the day. A lot of them were alive, and a bunch of them were dead. Okay, and what the fishermen were doing, they were sort of segregating the tiny little metapinase shrimp from the other catch, which was called the bycatch, or the stuff that you generally discard, it was discarded at that point of time. And it was pretty sort of crazy free handling days, and we'd measure the snakes, get them marked. The dead ones were quickly sort of put into sample bags, and the live ones were released. And basically, this moved on, and I got to know that basically trawlers were a big driver for sea snake mortality. There were a large number of sea snakes that were dying in trawlers. And I was speaking to my friends today, and actually at that point of time, it kind of reminds me of what I was doing. The entire focus was on the snakes. I was just looking at what was driving their mortality. It was like the length of the trawl, so how long they were kept submerged. And I was, making recommendations like reduce the duration of your trawl, because then the weight of your catch would likely also reduce. But this kind of stuff was happening pretty much all across the country. This is along the coast of Orissa. This was taken by another colleague, Bivash. And this is at a time when the turtles are just coming ashore to sort of lay their eggs. The largest sort of arivada that happens over there. And, literally over the last decade or 2 decades, there have been lakhs of turtles that have, suffered mortality due to trawls and gill nets. So trawls are dragged, gill nets are kept like big curtains, like open curtains in the sea, and basically animals run into them. So the cost of fishing or the production of seafood was really, really huge. And, that took me to sort of, I still wanted to sort of work on sea snakes, look at, again, with really sort of, with a really sort of focused mindset. I went down and I said, I'm going to be going to the Gulf of Mannar, and I began work over there. Now, these are sort of turtle stranding records from, from Goa just over the last year. So turtles and cetaceans, this was a sort of a coordinated effort between all these organizations. Terra Conscious, did the lead there. But these were things that were just stranded on shore, and they were caught in nets primarily, and they drowned and they were washed ashore. So you had a large number of these animals coming, getting washed ashore every year. So basically, this was all the stuff that was getting washed ashore, and obviously this raises a huge hue and cry. Large number of dolphins dying, large number of turtles dying. But what was driving all that? And I said I moved from Goa to kind of go to the Gulf of Mannar again to look at sea snakes. Moved along other parts of the coast, and what I found was that even though the fishermen said, yeah, they were once very common, I spent months over there, and I just got really few sea snakes. And I realized, basically, I was moving on to a PhD, and I realized that's definitely not going to give me data for my PhD, and I was a bit concerned. And I said, I got to move into larger bycatch issues. And that became a sort of a question as to, what I'm going to really do there. And when you think of the trawls catch, so when you think of the sea snakes and the sea turtles, that amounts to really a small proportion of the catch. Just a few animals would be like, the dead sea snakes, the dead turtles, and, the other endangered species. But most of it looks like this. It's a big mess of a large number of species. Now, when I was along the Coromandel coast, on the east coast of India, in the Bay of Bengal, there was like, over 500 odd species of pretty much everything that you can think of. So trawlers were targeting a couple of species, landing a whole lot of stuff. And as I said, when I started off my master's work, most of it was being shoveled overboard, All that bycatch was literally being dumped overboard. So the trawlers basically came under a huge amount of criticism, not just trawlers, but most fisheries came under a large amount of criticism for discarding a huge amount of bycatch. So in 2002, the stuff that was being discarded was huge. And they said this is not just an ecological catastrophe, it's also a livelihood problem. We are depriving, millions of poor coastal communities of a source of protein. It's very important to them. So according to the FAO Code of Conduct of Responsible Fisheries, you have to stop discarding. So basically, that's what really was going on. So you see this shot, so all the bycatch, lots of life forms, just being thrown overboard, dead or decomposing. And trawling, in many ways, is kind of like, clear felling a forest or going out, to catch, a couple of small creatures, like, say, butterflies using a big bulldozer, and pulling up everything that comes in your path, or a couple of worms and pulling up whatever comes in your path. So it's literally sort of, it leads to a lot of collateral damage. And this kind of stuff you don't see in a terrestrial environment. It's quite typical to the marine environment because you really don't know what's happening beneath the waves. So you really see a lot of this stuff happening on a regular scale. And this is a little snapshot from one of my study sites in South India. This happened in 2006 now. Okay, so basically this is a time when the trawlers have just come really early in the morning and all the catch is being landed. So there's first the stuff destined for the export markets, then the stuff for for the domestic markets, and a lot of the bycatch stuff like the big rays, lots of threatened endangered species being landed. The rays had very low value at that point of time. They were mainly sort of dried, and the dry meat was sold to Kerala. Now they've got value for their skin. The mantas have for their gill rakers, a whole bunch of things. But you see this low value thrash fish that I was talking about, the low value bycatch, which was being discarded when I started off my master's work, was being landed in huge quantities, So literally this was like 3-day-old semi-decomposing fish, being landed on the trawler. It was decomposed. So you had, like, as I said, it was over 500 odd species in that catch. So a large number of species. This was soon after the tsunami. So there was a lot of agriculture had been destroyed in that area, like, southern parts of Nagapattinam, etc. Lots of the agricultural area had been destroyed. Now these are large drying fields. These areas were converted into drying fields just for drying large amounts of decomposing fish meal. So there was huge amounts of an entire marine ecosystem being dried over there. And as I said, it was like, it's hot, it was humid, there was large amount of all this stuff getting decomposed. And you can see this person is actually sieving through the trash to get out some level of impurities, the sand and other stuff. And it's graded into different sort of, trash piles, basically. You have the high value trash, the low value trash. But what was giving this trash its value, and why did this stuff from being discarded, start being landed over time? Okay, and I began looking at the trends in that fishery, and basically looking at, old papers published, and what was very clear was if you had to rely on the traditionally targeted stocks, that was the shrimp, your cuttlefish and squid, a few other species that were going to the export markets, some of the important fish that was going to the domestic markets, you could not keep yourself afloat. You had to kind of move down a price list, So you were picking up pretty much whatever you could possibly get, low-value stuff that, most people would generally not eat in the condition it was, okay? You were picking it up, and all that was had a new market, at that point of time. There was a new market which was there, albeit in a very small way over the years, but this was the poultry industry. Okay, so the poultry industry in Chittoor, Namakkal, etc., was basically buying all this low-value trash fish. At that point of time, it was being sold for as low as, like, I think it was like 2 rupees 50 paisa a kilo if it was mixed. And if you managed to segregate the silver fish from the more shelly crustacean like trash fish, it was it was worth less. So all this stuff was going to the poultry industry. Now I'm talking about like, this was what, 2008. So it's kind of an old story now, And basically this stuff has been going on. Now there are entire fisheries that have been dedicated to reduction fisheries, that is catching fish to feed the animal industry. And as you can see, the Indian chicken industry, like the trawl fishing industry, which started off somewhere in the 1960s, has grown over time into a big major industry. And at that point of time, fish meal constituted about 6% of the chicken's diet, and obviously this varied. Now there is a lot more, fish meal being, put into the diet because the price of soy has gone up, and there is still a push to get good quality fish meal. And India has now started producing better quality fish meal. It's not just trawl fisheries; it's an entire fleet of sardine boats going out catching fish just to be ground for the poultry industry and for other animal feed industries. And this is something that I've shown before, but globally, chickens, pigs, and farm fish eat twice the amount of seafood an average Japanese person does at that point of time, 6 times the amount an average American does, and 36 times the amount an average Britain does. So this is a global average. So that's a lot of fish going into reduction fisheries, So currently, I know that it's approximately a third of the entire fisheries being directed for non-human purposes. So there's a whole logistic here. I mean, basically, you're catching a huge amount of food. Now, a lot of that food is not being used, as food, but it's being sent for other purposes. In India, it was for, the animal industry, as manure, for a whole bunch of things. We talk about these health capsule omega-3s, which have recently been shown that their effect is a bit questionable. So there's a recent paper that was done which looked at a large number of cases and actually looked at the effectiveness of omega-3s, and it's actually questionable. So a lot of that, the so-called cod liver oil, fish oils, which are believed to kind of, promote healthy hearts, and all that is not really true. But that's a lot of fish going into, just pulp. A lot of it was going into feeding farm fish. So lots of the farm fish that we're talking about. Last night, the night before last, we were served like smoked salmon, and a lot of the smoked salmon, in India, comes from farmed fish farms in Norway and in Chile. Okay, and now these salmon stocking densities are really high. They put a large number of salmon in the cages, but what is even more interesting is that they feed that wild-caught, this farm salmon, a huge amount of wild-caught fish. And, the conversion ratios are, again, huge. Like for cobia in India, it's like, you feed like 4 pounds for a kilo of cobia at the end of it. So there's a huge amount. So the conversion ratios don't really make too much of sense. And as I said, a lot of the fish meal was going into other industries as well, into prawn feed, into your pet feeds, So you get a whole lot of pet feeds, and you can actually choose what fish you want. You can get salmon, you can get mackerel, and they clearly advertise it as real fish, and and you get some that they're high in omega-3, they're environmentally friendly too, So it's a whole amount of fish that has this claim of being, sustainably caught to feed your pets. And as you can imagine, without saying, pets have a massive footprint as well, So basically, why have we come to this particular point? Okay, we live on a very sort of a blue planet, and while most of the Earth's surface is covered by water, we really know very little about the sea. Okay, and while every single sort of land, a land patch in our country outside is owned or managed in some fashion or the other, you see like fences. We're good at building fences on the land. The ocean is largely open access. You can go pretty much, put your net out. A lot of the trawlers, as we speak, in Nagapattinam, etc., had to actually stop fishing. Soon after the tsunamis, many of them actually went back to their small-scale boats because they were actually way more effective, cost-effective. They were making more profits because the costs of trawlers had gone up, and they were not making profits even if they were landing the low-value trash. So, in fact, right now there's a huge move in South India where they want to decommission a lot of trawlers. Like I think over 2,000 trawlers being decommissioned in the southern part of India, another 2,000 along the east coast, and they're going to be converted into longliners because it is believed that the big ocean EEZ, that's up to 200 nautical miles, is relatively unexploited. And apparently it has high stocks of tuna and other fish. But we really don't know that, and it's kind of a new, it's a real new open area that we're going to be dealing with, and with a whole range of new problems. Now, we went through one phase of industrialization somewhere in the 60s where we introduced trawlers, but right now fisheries is going into another phase of industrialization that is moving onto land in farm-based aquaculture, and also moving into the deep sea, like I said, to fish for tuna and other things. So as you can see, the major problem with the sea, it's largely open access. You can go out, you can fish where you want, you can catch how much you want. There are really no sort of limits at the moment. We kind of know what we're catching, but we really don't manage our fish stocks to the level we sort of have species-specific rules for. You can tell the number of tigers in any particular protected area and country. We really don't know what the stock of most species of fish are. We talk about shark conservation. CITES has NDF positive if you can sort of export a few sharks out of the country. India has given an NDF positive to many of the shark species, but we really don't know what the stocks are. We don't really know how many sharks are out there. And while many of you might cringe while looking at a picture of a species like a sambar, with its head decapitated, most of you, when you see this, you think of food. And in many ways, you would be right, because food is actually, if you think about it, it is one of the big solutions to the whole fisheries problem, because we've treated the sea as a food provider, and in many ways we have managed it for food. But currently, the way industrialized fisheries is going, is it's taking it to a whole different level. We're not supplying, we're not providing people with food anymore. It's a whole different logistics game, and it's leading to a whole range of other problems. And this also goes down to policy. This is not just typical to India, but pretty much when I move around, I see it very similar in other parts. You have the Department of Fisheries that is very production driven. They're talking about expanding fleets into the EEZ, moving the aquaculture domain, increasing fish production, like Tyasha just mentioned. And you have the Forest Department is quite restriction driven. It's kind of like it's based on species protection, habitat protection, etc. And basically, it leaves very often resource users in a very confused state. And this is not, as I said, it's not typical to this place. It's found pretty much world over. So as a solution, many people have typically looked upon ecolabels. Now, ecolabels basically, guarantee the consumer who's buying seafood in a marketplace, a sustainability guarantee. You're saying you're catching fish sustainably, which is also, basically protecting the rights of fishermen, providing livelihood to a large number of people, keeping the health of the ecosystem intact, and a whole bunch of things. And the most famous one of them is like the Marine Stewardship Council, which is also considered the most effective. Now, let me tell you, the other day I was in a supermarket in Goa where where a friend of mine actually showed me this little can of herring that was fished in the Baltic. They beautifully mentioned the source, Baltic Sea, wasabi flavored herring, and basically, it was caught in the Baltic Sea. It's an MSC. Or it had an eco label, but it's flown halfway across the world. Now, a lot of the salmon that we are seeing on our plates here have spent about as long as 18 months in a container, and some of it has traveled like about 27,000 miles. So it's a huge network of stuff. The stuff in Goa that I was talking about, lots of the seafood that we get off season. Before in the off season, we would never eat fish, or we would eat dry fish or fish that was caught by traditional methods, that was caught from the rivers, that was caught by methods that depended on a healthy ecology. Right now, we sort of, we're just sort of going for an eco label, which actually takes you as far away from your food source as you can imagine. So, how do we get past this? And over the years, I was just thinking about it. at a large scale, it's very difficult to sort of talk about, the logistics of fisheries to predict where what is going. And in fact, I've had a lot of, discussions with, with other friends and colleagues, Pooja Rathod. We're talking about like, how do you sort of guarantee this, like because, she and other colleagues started the Know Your Fish, the Know Your Fish program that, talks about seasonal fish that I happen to also advise and, work closely with. And what's interesting is that, this is really interesting because for the first time, Indian consumers have an opportunity to actually know their fish, at least what's caught in their surrounds, and eat seasonally. So this is very, it's very fixed for the West Coast, and there's another called in-season fish that is specific to the East Coast. But as I told you a little earlier, there's no way to guarantee that the fish on your plate is caught from either the West Coast or the East Coast, So this is great to kind of know your fish, and I think this is something that we all should refer to, But actually sort of putting your whole reliance on, on particular programs or labels actually takes you away from the real issues in many ways. So this is something that you definitely got to refer to, but also keep in mind that basically there's a lot that goes into the seafood sector, a lot that goes into the logistics of seafood, and that's the main problem. And a lot of it doesn't reach people that really need fish. Okay, so in the monsoon fishing ban, which was like 2 months, I actually went on this little trip where I said, I'm not going to eat fish that was being served to me in the restaurants. Even my dad at that point was saying, what's the problem? There's a fishing van there. They're supplying you with fresh fish. But I said, let me see if I can, formulate a certain strategy wherein I was, eating fish that I believe was sustainable or caught in particular methods. And I resorted to lots of the fish that was being brought from riverine fisheries, around my area. Now, I know that a lot of you may not have the luxury to do this, but I think this is something that really works because 2 things it did. One thing, it connected me to a whole diversity. There's a huge biodiversity that was present in our diets that we have lost, and this diversity still exists. Now, this is a little awl or a burrowing goby that comes out only when the rain really beats the river hard and it gets disturbed from its sediments. It comes out, it migrates, and it then lays its eggs. Okay, so you get this only for a short period of time, and I managed to get about 45 different species over this 60-month cycle. You don't have to eat a fish every single day, but I got a whole bunch of things. Spiny flatheads, toadfish, and a lot of other stuff that tastes perfectly delicious, but is kind of totally missing from our diets, and we've lost a lot of this diversity from our diets. And I think 2 things. Another thing that it did was it connected me, to have species like this, you need a system that is really thriving. You need a biodiverse system. A lot of these were caught in nets that were passive. They needed to just be there. They could only be caught in a spring tide. That is when the tide's at its strongest, when the Earth, Sun, and the Moon are on the same line and the tide's pulling the hardest. That's the time they put out these nets and they catch these fish. So you can't really overexploit a lot of this stuff. Now, I spoke to Pooja, I spoke to Mayuresh and a few others who work with Know Your Fish. And at one point of time, we're thinking, do we really want to connect these guys to the hotels, or is it individuals who should be supporting them? And I think the answer then came down was quite obvious. It is individuals, because the minute you sort of push a demand, you're really going to sort of cause an overfishing of a particular resource in a place. And as I said, there were like, 45 different species at that point of time. So the little experiment, not just in fish, but a whole bunch of vegetables that come out at a particular time. Right now, you don't know where your stuff comes from, there is stuff coming from everywhere. Yeah, so I was talking about salmon, and salmon is one of the most commonly farmed fish that we're eating in India today. And right now, there are 2 companies, I think, that are serving or that have been importing salmon, and you can get it, Achari style, Mughlai style, and I really don't understand it. Why do you want salmon with the Indian flavors when you could perfectly have other, local fish that taste equally good with great Indian recipes? And another thing, there are lots of restaurants in Mumbai, in Bangalore, and Chennai that are currently serving, exotic fish that are really high priced. Like you can get barramundi, which is your Asian sea bass, but it's farmed in Australia. But we've got a steady, good stock of barramundi in most of our estuaries. But the thing is, We are dependent on Australian farmed barramundi because we believe it's healthier, high in omega-3. We get farm scallops from Tasmania. We're getting Patagonian toothfish, which is now, which there is one sort of stock that's been certified, but most probably we're getting it from uncertified stocks. And that's got a huge sort of a flying footprint as well. And, another thing was, the other thing was basically eating fresh, So this is like in little ponds back in Goa, wherein you just pull up the salvinia. A lot of these guys, a lot of the communities did that. This is a little rice field loach. And these rice field loaches basically live on the roots of these floating vegetation, and they just catch it. But that's the whole point of having super fresh fish, which you're guaranteed is fresh. It's not just from the aquaculture department. If you go to West Bengal, there's a huge price difference for this climbing perch. It's called koi mach. How many of you are Bengali over here? Okay. Oh, good, a lot. So the koi mach, there's like almost a third in the difference in prices if you supply live koi mach or dead, or the live pakal or dead pakal. It's like there's a huge price difference. And the thing is, we don't all have the luxury of getting this live fish. The live reef fish trade is another thing. Wherein you're shipping fish all the way from some part of Indonesia. It goes to Hong Kong and then it makes its way around Asia. That's a different issue. There's a huge mortality, but when you know that it's supplied fresh from your backwater, nothing like it, And that's the great part about the Bengalis. Even just outside Kolkata, pretty much every household has got a little pond. The buns on the pond, they grow a nice orange sweet potato, a whole bunch of other vegetables. You have your fish in the pond. And it's not just, right now there's a change to the larger carp and other stuff, but a lot of the Bengalis had a preference for the smaller species as well, the morula, the puti, and a whole range of that. All that's going now, In Orissa, they allowed their fields to be flooded, and you had species like koi mach, etc., coming out to breed and then going back to the spawns. They were harvested for a few months of the year, and then they were allowed to breed in the ponds. All those ponds are now being taken up by non-native, exotic species of carps that are being brought in. Now, just a little about the mudskipper. Now, if there's a little story from Vasai. If you go to Vasai, there are these huge mud flats, And Vasai is a place just outside Mumbai, which is very interesting because, it's kind of like, it's a little idyllic spot just on the outskirts of Mumbai in many ways. It's kind of a suburb of Mumbai, just across the river. What's interesting is that the Vasai residents really sort of, push for no large development. Their mud flats should be free from large buildings, etc. And I met some of these people. And one of the things they told me is the mud flats were very important to glean for food. And this mudskipper, is the little fish that pretty much spends more of its life on land than in water. It can actually breathe through its skin, even though it can take gulps of water and spend time in the water. But the mudskipper, a whole range of clams, bivalves, etc., will be collected from the mud flats. So the big agitations happened because they wanted to kind of preserve those mud flats. Okay, now the area is highly polluted, and they're losing that in any case. But the thing is, it was the nudity that kind of saved these areas in a big way. And it was the people who supported the consumption of these species. So you see, in many ways, you see this as consumption and the way our food systems work actually have a huge cost. But in other ways, they can also be looked upon as a solution, in terms of, especially if you promote diversity, if you promote the local economy, etc. I was talking about the small fish, like this is morula and puti mixed. And lots of the Bengalis, if you go to Bangladesh, it's actually very common. They actually prefer the smaller fish. And even the restocking, I just got back from a project in Bangladesh, wherein they are restocking with these small indigenous species. Now, when you talk about these small species, they're generally, they are lower down in the food web. They have a very low impact, even if you harvest a large number of them. And they can sort of restock relatively easier. And you can restock areas quite easily as well. Besides that, they're highly nutritious. And when I talk about that, okay, I recommend eating small fish for anyone. But this is particularly important for poor malnourished communities. Because the important part about small fish is you can eat the entire fish, And they are high in like a whole range of, not just proteins, but because you eat the bones, it's high in potassium, selenium, a whole range of other vitamins that you typically do not get from eating large fillets, what a lot of people are used to. People want fish that are clean, filleted, without bones. That's what we're eating now. And I think there's a responsibility that goes along with kind of promoting this kind of aquaculture. It's nutrition-sensitive aquaculture. And if you look at this, a lot of these communities at one point of time were suffering from something called hidden hunger, wherein they were seemingly eating a lot of rice and a few and a few fish, etc. But these were providing them with very important sources of these nutrients, which was not coming otherwise. And basically, just restocking and reprovisioning these communities with these nutrients, helped a lot of women, especially children in their early first 1,000 days, pregnant women, etc. In West Africa, there was also a great preference for the small fish, and you would have women and generally kids who fish for the small fish, whereas the men went out and caught other stuff. They would fish the inland waters. And you see that the inland fisheries in India, in a big way, there's a big role that women play in the whole fisheries. So support small fish. Now, when we talk about aquaculture, so on that 60-day experiment of mine, like I was experimenting not just with what to eat, but also with little recipes. And this is a nice little black clam choris recipe in Goa. Now, the black clam is something that occurs as the salinity begins to get less inland, and they kind of peak, just before the monsoons. So you can collect a large number of them without really, impacting the black clam. And I've been getting them year after year, and from a fisherman I know just lives down the bend. Now, bivalves are really the future if you're thinking of eating sustainably. Bivalves are right down the food web. They're filter feeders. They can recuperate relatively easily. As aquaculture, they're great. It's a great solution to aquaculture. They're high in proteins, essential nutrients. So if you think about the future of fisheries or aquaculture, right now, about 53% of our seafood comes from the farm fish sector. It was very different like about 10 years ago, And India is moving towards the farm fish sector because our wild fish is no longer making up the catch anymore, we have to move. There's a large amount of, movement of wild fish taking place, and we are increasingly dependent on aquaculture. But the diversity in aquaculture currently is very small. Globally, I think we farm about, say, 570 odd species, whereas wild fisheries is about, 2,500 odd species. So that's the diversity. And what I'm saying is that the point I'm trying to make here is wild fisheries, aquaculture can never replace wild fisheries in terms of nutrition. But it has to, in some way, take the burden off the sea, And that can be done if you sort of think of these nutrition-sensitive policies, where you're sort of introducing a whole bunch of species, which adds to our diet, etc. Now, bivalves is definitely one solution. Besides that is seaweed, very easy to grow, low footprint, and this is something that, we should be looking at. There have been various initiatives, like for mussels, for oysters, and for seaweeds happening in the Gulf of Mannar. But you look at the scale. For example, in Korea and Japan, it's huge. It takes up relatively small areas, and you can also have these closed-loop cycles wherein you have a whole number of species in a particular area, and it provides food for a large number of people. Now, if you're talking about omega-3 and you need this for a healthy heart, etc., there's the whole idea of cutting out the middle fish, where you don't really need the fish to get omega-3. You can pretty much get them from like the algae that the fish eat. And that's much easier to grow in much smaller areas, There's a species called nano, it's Nanochloropsis, but it's really small. It can be grown in small troughs, and you can harvest it relatively easy. And I think these are the solutions we need to be looking at. Because if this has to go like this, now I think 5 or 6 of the big fishing companies have come together and, promised that their seafood supply chains are going to be, low on bycatch, low on slavery, because there's a whole range of other issues associated with fisheries. I think we need to look at solutions that are also simpler and in our backyard. And another big thing about I keep using the example of the Bengalis because they still continue to live what I'm saying right now. It's kind of eating every part, basically. So actually at one point of time, pretty much all cultures did that. If you went to Tamil Nadu, there's a very famous fish head recipe that you can get in Singapore and Malaysia. It's called kepala ikan. Kepala is the head, and ikan is a fish. And basically that recipe originated in Tamil Nadu. It comes from, it's a Tamil recipe, wherein basically the fish was chopped and every other part was used, including the intestines used to make a separate recipe. And the Thais still make lots of preparations on the intestine, and actually eating organ is good for you at certain point of time. There are certain vitamins and nutrients that you get from organs that you can't get otherwise. And if you flavor it with the right ingredients, it's actually really tasty. Now, fish head is actually delicious, by the way. So that's a fish head curry I tried with a little invasive carp. You're getting these big carps, and all they're doing is they're like filleting them, and they get these huge heads, and this is a big head carp, which is now kind of, flooding the old agricultural fields in Punjab and Haryana, And these carps are basically Chinese. They're not even an Indian species. We have rohu, katla, mrigal, which is also being grown in a big way. And, we have other species like that, what is called Rupchand march in Bengali. And it's actually a species or a kind of a piranha, which is South American. It was introduced in the aquarium trade some years ago. It got out and it flourished. So parts of the Teesta, etc., have shoals of these species living around. But the interesting part is it's really formed part of our diet. And now you see it in it's not common. Like you ask a Bengali household, have you eaten this? And they say, yeah. And what's happening to us right now is all this stuff, whether it's invasive or whatever we are eating is kind of being normalized. We are losing diversity. Very soon we'll see this as the normal standard, And it's not necessarily normal. I'm not saying that, whatever happened in the past is the gold standard, but I'm saying we are losing diversity, and it's something that we need to sort of re-promote. And aquaculture has a big responsibility here. So basically now there are farms through Andhra wherein shrimp farming is failing because of disease. They're growing other forms of shrimp being brought from the Pacific, like the Pacific white-leg shrimp that grows really large. It doesn't catch the same diseases as the tiger prawn. Okay, but what's happening is that basically you're losing diversity in local species. There's escapes, there's pollution, there's mangrove clear felling, etc. And you have a lot of these other species that are coming in that are not really part of our diet. Now tilapia is kind of replaced curry mean in many of the big Malayali restaurants in Kerala. So you're asking for curry mean and you're getting tilapia, which is a cichlid. It looks identical. It looks for a new piscivo, it looks identical. And you have to try that curry mean and all that. Okay, so we go and we get a big tilapia. And you have this another tilapia called Gift. It's genetically improved farm tilapia, which is this huge thing that looks like a snapper. It looks perfect, but it's really taking over our waterways. And do we really want that? Or we really want a diversity in our seafood and a diversity in our diets finally? And with that, I'd like to end with this particular picture. And why I put this up, I really sort of relish that particular fish. It's a fish called the Pacific sorry. You get it through the East Sea, between Japan and Korea. And I was on this remote island called Ulleungdo. Okay, we were doing this project where they were looking at a closed-looped aquaculture system, and looking at what was possible on this island. And this fish was being caught with a very interesting method. You know how they caught this fish? They didn't use a net or anything like that. These guys went out to sea. They sung songs and did the typical thing that a lot of fishermen do. But then they held seaweed in their hand and they began to shake it in the water. And when you do that, the seaweed bobs. These fish come and they stick themselves in between your fingers and they squirt their eggs out, and they caught them with their hand. And the word for this kind of fishing is called song kong chi, which means hand kong chi, And obviously this fish was delicious in more ways than one, And I relished it because of that. And there are many other sort of methods that you still have going that need to be supported. What I'm saying is you're not going to be able to supply the globe and all of India with fish that's caught in this way. But where we can be responsible, I think we should push it. And I'd like to end with that. Thank you.